I've written a book I've titled Replacing Darwin, The New Origin of Species. Provocative title, and to many people, perhaps puzzling. Why are we still debating this scientific topic that's over 150 years old? How many other debates from the 19th century we're still arguing about? Why are these creationists still making a stink? Why aren't they getting with the times? Why is there still controversy? And the answer to that is, there's many answers. One is we're dealing with a very unusual question. The origin of species. What's a species? Well, this is a modern debate because we haven't had that term in a globally accepted use really until the last 300 years. Carolus Linnaeus is called the father of modern taxonomy because he, in the 1700s, gave us the genus species system of classification that we all use today. We're Homo sapiens. Homo is the genus, sapiens the species. That goes back to Linnaeus. One of the prominent editions of his catalog of species is 1758. So really, you can't have a debate over the origin of species before then because you don't have species. These animals exist, these plants exist, but we don't have a term where we can agree on and say, this is what we're trying to explain. This is the problem for which we're trying to find a solution. Now, in his day, he's the beginner, he's the father, so it's going to be a small subset of what actually exists. And to use a marker for how much he had, think of mammals. So we're classified as mammals, suckle our young, so forth. Elephants, giraffes, zebras, whales, all mammals. Linnaeus listed less than 200 mammal species, 1758. Today we have over 5,400. So massive growth in what we recognize as mammals today. 1859, Darwin knew, the scientific community knew, of less than half the species we have documented today. So today, conservation websites, classification websites will list around 1.6 million species. So there's hundreds of thousands of species that Darwin, the community, knew nothing about. I like to think of the origin of species as analogous to a jigsaw puzzle. I've done many in my lifetime. One of the first things I do is I look for the edges. There's only so many. It sets specific boundaries. I have a sense for how big the puzzle is going to be. I compare it to the box cover. We're dealing with a puzzle of sorts. Where do species come from? How do they arise? But we have no box cover. We don't know the final number of species. Some conservatively estimate that there's going to be 10 million species eventually discovered. So we still don't know the majority of species. Some say 50 million. It's a wide range. Species are like pieces to the puzzle, and the clues to their origins represent pieces of this puzzle. And so you can think of evolution then as a puzzle in which all the pieces are connected. Everything's related. It's all one big gigantic puzzle that goes back to that single cell. The competing idea in Darwin's day was the idea that all species were fixed. And you can see where this idea would come from. It wasn't from scripture per se, but let's say you only know of a subset of all the species that are alive today. You go to the Arctic, you see a polar bear, an Arctic hare, an Arctic fox. These white coats camouflage them, they blend in. They're well suited for their environment. You go further south, North America has the black bear. If you're looking for a bear, it's a black coat. It blends in a lot better in the forests than a polar bear would. You go to Eurasia, you have a red fox, not an Arctic fox. You know, the Eurasian one blends in better to its environment. You go to the desert, you have a jackrabbit. Big long ears, no white coat. It's suited to its environment. So wherever you go around the globe, species appear to be designed for their environments. And so then it's just natural to say it's as if they've always lived there, implying they're not related to anything else, and they've always been in their current location. So Darwin came in, had a few more clues, a few more species, looked at the geography of species globally, because we've gotten to Central Africa, we've discovered Australia. There's all these things now, these advances. We've discovered the animals of Australia. Anyway, he can now put different pieces together and say, no, it actually looks like species have migrated to their present locations. And even from geography alone, you can make an argument that some are related, have a common ancestry. Now, Darwin really swung the pendulum completely the other way to go from no species are related, and all are fixed in their geography to everything's related, everything's migrated. It's a huge swing. Now, 150 years later, over 150 years later, we've got more pieces to the puzzle. We've got more clues. We've got more species. There's been a real revolution. So Darwin had no edge pieces. Thinking about what species are, we intuitively recognize zebra by its stripes, elephant by its trunk, giraffe by its neck. They're defined by traits. Well, those traits are consistent generation to generation. Giraffes produce giraffes. That's a kindergarten example. But there's a really profound biological point in that. If a giraffe could reproduce and produce an elephant, which then could produce a fox, and there was change every generation, we wouldn't even have the term species in our vocabulary. Just the fact that this term exists implies that there's a genetic continuity, consistency. So species are defined by traits. Traits are defined by genetics. So if you want to know the origin of a giraffe, you've got to know the origin of the long neck. You want to know the origin of an elephant, you've got to know the origin of trunks, which means you have to know the origin of the DNA encoding these traits. So when Darwin wrote on the origin of species, he was trying to answer a fundamentally genetic question. Now, how much genetics did Darwin know? He told us, and told us what the community knew in 1859. The summary section of chapter 5 says, "Our ignorance of the laws of variation is profound." He didn't even use the term genetics. Why? Because the term wasn't invented until the turn of the century. That's how primitive the understanding was. So Darwin took this massive risk in trying to answer a fundamentally genetic question a century and a half before we'd have any data to answer it. And Watson and Crick discovered the structure of DNA in 1953. Nearly 100 years after Darwin, we finally can say, oh, it's DNA is where we should go looking. 50 years later, we finally have the DNA sequences of thousands of species, not even millions. We still don't have the DNA from all the species around the planet. So it's really, now is the first time we can answer his question directly with scientific data. That's not talked about much, because if you say Darwin took a risk, everything we've accepted as fact for the last 150 years now becomes uncertain. That raises the question then as well. If Darwin took such a big risk, trying to answer a question that's deeply genetic without having any genetic data whatsoever, why did people believe him? Why did the scientific community get persuaded? So thinking about a puzzle analogy, genetics is the edge pieces of the puzzle. Centerpieces are non-genetic evidences. He was able to find some connections. Now, centerpieces do not have as strict connectivity, let's say, as the edge. You can put them in different ways, and it seems plausible. So you can easily make erroneous connections. And that's what he did. He was easily able to refute species fixity of species geography. Well, there's been new ideas that have arisen, some old ideas that have been developed since 1859. Homology, homo, the same, the study of biological sameness. Why is the structure of our forelimbs similar to that of a dog and a bird and a whale? Evolutionists say, because that pattern was inherited. We can now say, actually, humans design things with similarity. Humans design things in certain patterns. There's all these evidences that Darwin used for evolution that we can now say, that fits equally well with design. He connected these pieces together, and we say, no, this piece fits over here in the puzzle just fine. So that was not persuasive evidence. So Darwin takes this risk. He puts connections together where none should exist because they can fit here, 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 and here. He doesn't have any edge pieces to constrain what he's doing. Now we have the edge pieces. Now we've unlocked and reconnected some of his centerpieces. We've also discovered the corner pieces. And this is maybe the most shocking find to me of the last 150 years. Let's put Darwin's ideas in DNA terms. DNA is copied in our cells. It's the substance of heredity. But there are, in a sense, typos that are made. There's mistakes. A very small percentage of our total DNA. Out of 6 billion letters, around 80 get changed per generation. But over millions of years, those could add up and maybe produce a new species, and that's the evolutionary mindset. Well, you think of the history of genetics. DNA is first established as the substance of heredity. Then we get DNA sequences. The last thing to be discovered is the rate at which DNA mutates. Irony of ironies, research in the last 5 years has shown that the young Earth 6,000-year model for the origin of species can predict the mutation rate, and the evolutionary model cannot. Why is this significant? Again, this is the engine of evolution. It's significant because of the history of the debate. In the 1950s or so, evolutionists would criticize creationists, saying, you can pick apart ideas all you want, but until you come up with something better, no place at the table. Give us a testable prediction. Well, now we've come full circle. And I can predict for the evolutionist, this is going to be the mutation rate in dogs. This is how fast dog DNA is going to mutate. This is how fast or slow cat DNA is going to mutate. And we don't know yet, but I can predict it. And so forth. That completely reverses roles. So there are several reasons we're still debating this topic 150 years later. The subject matter is constantly changing. Darwin took a gigantic risk trying to answer a fundamentally genetic question before we'd have the genetic data. And it's really for the first time now that we can answer this question of the origin of species. His opponents were time-bound. The opposition changes, it matures, and it's very different than when it was in 1859. And his old evidences don't reject the new evidences, the new models. And now that this data is out there and there's a bunch of creationist minds working on it together, they've actually not only rebutted evolutionary models, they've replaced them, which is the title of my book, then Replacing Darwin, because I think we've come full circle. The young earth movement has matured so far that this is really the dawn of a new era in which the creationists are taking the lead on those questions in which evolution should be the first to have the answers. So I'm really excited about what has happened and where this is going and how much more there is to discover and to confirm what the scripture says.